Barbara Kuriga.
Mr. Speaker, in 1969, man first walked on the moon. In 1965, the film The Sound of Music was released, and the Beatles won their first Grammy. All are memories today, and we look back fondly and say, oh, what a great time the 60s were, and I know that there's been comment from the other side of the House about some of us who can remember that, and it definitely is within my age range. But Mr. Speaker, the Radiation Protection Act was introduced in 1965, and it is very true how times have changed, and he did. Is that when Winston came in? So really this legislation now that we have in front of us is in fact obsolete and doesn't reflect the current use of radiation sources, and it's inconsistent with international standards. So Mr. Speaker, in 2015 it's clear that we need an overhaul of certain pieces of archaic legislation, and this Radiation Safety Bill aims to modernise that outdated Radiation Protection Act from 50 years ago. And in the past 50 years, radiation technology has become far more intricate, with the development of techniques that, if in the wrong hands, could become very dangerous and cause serious damage. Yet radiation technology has also developed for the better, particularly in regards to oncology and cancer research and treatment. So 7 years ago, Mr. Speaker, this national government inherited some services around the treatment of cancer that were not adequate for New Zealanders, where Kiwis were needing to go overseas for their treatment. And thankfully now those days are over. And this government since then has invested more than $100 million to support cancer patients in New Zealand. And since then patients have received faster and more effective treatments. And New Zealand is now in line with the international standards of 4 to 6 weeks waiting time for patients. That's right. Investment in radiation technology means accuracy in targeting cancer is achieved, and therefore more New Zealanders are receiving their treatment when they need to and on time. That's right. Mr. Speaker, those patients that need specialist attention in New Zealand are benefited today by the Radiation Safety Bill that's before the House. This bill encourages the safe use of radiation techniques and technology and requires every person who uses that radiation source to ensure the safety from any adverse effects of radiation. I recently spent some time with the mobile surgical bus, very lucky to be able to go and have a look at that as it was sitting outside a hospital in Tamaranui, and it was performing a number of operations that were standard operations, day visits, uncomplicated, and things that were expected to go without event and mean that patients could have their treatment far closer to home. And as we work in regional areas, and we find now that more people can't live, obviously next to a major hospital, we are looking more at primary care, we are looking at options of taking medical surgery and a range of other things around the country. And I think it's really important in this safety feature that this legislation is enacted, because it's really important that if it is uptaken around the country in more places in the future, that we need to be sure that it's safe. And I've learned a huge amount today in my limited knowledge, Mr. Speaker, about radiation. And when I actually looked up to see what ionising radiation is, I think our chair of our Health Select Committee before put it in some quite good words, and I'm not going to repeat it, but it was a big long Wikipedia explanation of what it actually means. And patients actually don't need to know this necessarily. They don't need to understand what it means, but they do need to know that it's well understood and that they are protected from any dangers associated with the use of this radiation. So the Radiation Bill, Mr. Speaker, will enable the protection of health and safety of all in New Zealand, and it's also protecting the environment from the harmful effects of radiation if it's not used carefully, effectively and well monitored. This bill also leaves provisions for the safe use of radiation in health services and research where it is vital for development. And this bill will also enable New Zealand to meet its international obligations. It needs to, relating to radiation, safety and security. The old legislation had no provision for the preparation of safety and security plans by licensed users of radiation, and nor the registration of radiation sources. This new legislation establishes that all sources of radiation must have relevant authorisation to source and use radiation technologies. And at the moment, as mentioned earlier, the majority of users of radiation technology are those in the health sector for diagnostic and treatment purposes. It's crucial that these services and sources are retained and regulated. However, Mr. Speaker, with nearly 4,500 licensed users of radiation sources in New Zealand, it goes without saying that there may be many sources who currently are not covering what's actually appropriate and what we are looking to change in the legislation as far as this bill is concerned. So we have to make sure that what we do and what people are doing out there has no potential to harm New Zealanders and their environment. So, Mr. Speaker, this bill will ensure that the benefits from radiation usage will outweigh the risk of harm to people and any harm to society. And it's imperative that this is adequately and accurately monitored and measured to prevent mishap and any harm that could result. So radiation should not be used unless it's fit for the purpose of which it is intended. Therefore, this bill outlines provisions that all reasonable steps must be taken to ensure that the safe containment of a radiation source to minimise accidents should occur. The bill outlines that the general public are not able to utilise up their own radiation sources and for warranted reasons. If anyone were able to use radiation at their leisure, the security of New Zealand and safety of its citizens would be in a very threatened position. There would be no way to regulate radiation use and no way to make it safe. On this note, if people were to use radiation technologies out in the everyday public, while they think they are being careful, they may not actually be safe uses and they may end up doing more harm or more damage. Mr. Speaker, this bill sets out the consequences of non-compliance, which are extremely justified with regards to the high intensity of radiation and the damage that can happen when it's misused. To manufacture, possess or control radiation source or even to import or export radioactive material could have adverse damaging effects on New Zealanders and the environment. In summary, Mr. Speaker, the benefits of this legislation means that New Zealand will be in line with international best practice, will be able to give effect to relevant international standards, thereby enhancing New Zealand's international credibility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.